Mabel Hartwell shoved the rope into the rancher's chest before he could say a word. "Her name's Bess, she said. She gives 3 gallons a day, she's never been sick a day in her life, and she's worth twice what I'm asking." Her voice didn't shake. She'd made sure of that on the 3-mile walk over. "I want 1 room, 4 walls and a roof that holds. That's the trade. Take it or don't." Caleb Whitmore looked down at the rope against his chest. Then he looked at the woman who'd put it there. He did not take the rope. "Keep your cow," he said. "Stay anyway." If that just stopped your heart a little, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop your city down in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Willow Creek, Montana, 1884, and find out what one desperate morning changed for the rest of Mabel Hartwell's life. Mabel had not planned to shove the rope at him. She had planned to be dignified about it. Measured. She had rehearsed the whole thing on the walk over 3 miles of dusty road with Bess plodding beside her. Both of them sweating in the August heat, and in every version of the conversation she'd practiced, she had been calm and businesslike and had not done anything that could be interpreted as desperation. Then she'd walked into Caleb Whitmore's yard and seen him standing there big and still as a fence post, watching her come up the road with that flat, unreadable expression on his face, and every rehearsed word had dissolved, and she'd done the only thing that felt honest. She'd put the rope in his hands and told him what she needed. Now he was holding it back out to her, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. "I don't want charity," she said. "I'm not offering charity," Caleb said. "I'm offering a room." "That's the same thing." "It's not." He looped the rope back into her hands slowly, like a man who'd decided on something and wasn't going to be argued out of it. "Charity is something for nothing. What I'm talking about is something for something. I've got a dairy operation that's been going wrong all spring, and I can't figure out why. You know dairy work." She stared at him. "How do you know I know dairy work?" "Clem Hatcher told me. He was at the market when you sold your last batch of butter in April, said it was the best he'd tasted in years, and asked who made it." He looked at her steadily. "I remember things." Mabel looked down at the rope in her hands, then back at him. "And if I can't fix your dairy problem?" "Then we renegotiate," he said. "But I don't think that's going to happen." She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument forming, all the reasons this was a bad idea, all the ways kindness from a stranger had previously cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She had a whole list of those. It had gotten longer every year since Thomas died. "Why?" she said instead. The word came out quieter than she intended. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Not uncomfortable quiet, just the quiet of a man who thought before he spoke, which she was not entirely used to. "Because somebody should have helped you before now," he said. "And they didn't." He turned toward the house. "Come on, I'll show you the room. Supper's at 6. Don't be late, my housekeeper doesn't hold plates." He walked away. Mabel stood in the yard with Bess's rope in her hand and looked at his back. "Mr. Whitmore," she called. He stopped, turned. "I want it on record," she said, "that I came here to make a fair trade, not to take something I didn't earn." He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "Noted," he said. "It's on record." He turned back toward the house. "Now come inside before you fall over. You look like you haven't eaten since Thursday." She had not eaten since Thursday. She followed him. She hated how much she needed to. The room was small and clean and had a window that faced east. Mabel stood in the center of it and looked at the bed. A real bed with a real mattress. Not the hay pile she'd been sleeping on in the barn for 3 weeks, and she kept her face very still and her hands very still, and she breathed slowly until the tightness in her chest loosened enough that she trusted herself to move again. "Bess can go in the far stall," Caleb said from the doorway. "I'll have one of the hands set it up." "I'll do it myself," Mabel said. "All right. And I want to start on the dairy problem tomorrow morning, first thing." "I figured you would," he said. She turned to look at him. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her in that careful, attentive way he had not intrusive, just present. like a man who paid attention to things without making you feel surveyed by it. "You're not what I expected," she said before she could stop herself. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly," she said honestly. "People in town say you're cold." "People in town say a lot of things," he said. "They say you've never married." "Also true." "They say you don't like people much." He considered that for a moment. "I don't like foolishness much," he said. "There's a difference." He pushed off the doorframe. "Supper's at 6, Mrs. Hartwell. Welcome to the ranch." He left. Mabel sat down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds. Then she stood back up, straightened her dress, and went to get Bess settled. She did not have the luxury of falling apart. She never had. But for just those 30 seconds, she let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that she had walked 3 miles in August heat, prepared to give away the last good thing she owned, and this stranger had handed it back to her. She let herself feel it, all of it, and then she folded it up small and put it somewhere she didn't have to look at right now, and she went back to work. That was how you survived. You felt things on your own time, in your own corners, and then you kept moving. Breakfast the next morning told her everything she needed to know about the ranch and the people on it. There were 7 hands eating at the long table when she came in. She'd been up since 5, had already checked on Bess and taken her first look at the dairy barn, and had found 3 things she wanted to ask Caleb about before noon. But the moment she walked through the kitchen door, the table went quiet in a way that had texture to it. Not hostile, just assessing. She had walked into rooms like this before. Rooms where people had already decided something about you before you opened your mouth, and the only question was whether you were going to let that stand. She pulled out a chair and sat down. "Morning," she said to no one in particular and everyone in general. A few murmured responses. 1 or 2 hats touched briefly. One young hand, barely 20, red-eared with the look of someone who'd been talking recently and regretted it, looked at his plate. Caleb came in from outside and sat at the head of the table. He looked around once. Something in his expression said he'd read the room already and filed it away. "Mrs. Hartwell's running the dairy operation," he said casually, "the way you'd mentioned the weather. Any questions about how the barn's being run, you ask her." He reached for the coffee. "Hank, I need to talk to you after breakfast. And Pete." He glanced at the red-eared young man. "The north fence still needs finishing." Pete nodded fast and went back to his eggs. That was all. No speech. No explanation. No defense of her presence or her capabilities. Just the information stated plainly, and then the conversation moved on. Mabel reached for the bread and thought that she had not given Caleb Whitmore enough credit. He hadn't made her feel like a charity case in front of his men. He hadn't introduced her as the widow he'd taken in, hadn't framed her as a guest or a burden or a situation to be managed. He'd given her a title and an authority and walked away from it. She ate her breakfast and said very little and listened to everything. The dairy barn gave her the answer she was looking for before 8 o'clock. She walked every inch of it twice, checked every storage bin, looked at the feed logs someone had been keeping in a water-stained notebook by the door, and did the math in her head while she walked the pasture line. By the time Caleb found her standing at the east fence with the notebook in her hands, she had the whole picture. "Feed ratio's been wrong since March," she said without looking up. "Somebody changed the grain mix, probably trying to stretch the budget, and it's been showing up in the milk volume ever since. Fat content's off too, which is why your butter output dropped." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "How long to fix it?" 2 weeks to see real improvement. You can't correct it all at once or you'll stress the cows." She looked up. "Who changed the mix?" "Hank probably. I told him in February we were over budget on feed. He was trying to help." "He was," Caleb said. "He just didn't know what he didn't know." He looked at the notebook. "What else?" "The rotation schedule is wrong. You're overusing the east pasture and the grass hasn't had time to recover. The cows are getting less nutrition per acre than they should." She flipped to the page where she'd made notes. "And whoever's been doing the morning checks hasn't been consistent about it. The records jump around. You can't make good decisions on bad data." "No," he agreed. "You can't." He took the notebook from her, looked at her handwriting in the margins, neat, precise, organized by problem and solution. You did all this before 8 o'clock. I was up at 5. I know, he said. I saw the barn light. She looked at him. He was looking at her notes, but something in his posture had changed, a small shift that she couldn't quite name. I'll put together a proper schedule today, she said. Written out so anyone covering can follow it. And I want to adjust the feed mix gradually starting tomorrow. I'll show whoever does the morning feed exactly what proportions. That'll be Pete, Caleb said. And he'll do what you tell him. He'd better, she said without thinking. Caleb glanced at her, then and there it was again, that almost thing in his expression, the one that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same territory. He will, he said, and she believed him. The problem with Pete was not Pete. The problem with Pete was that Pete was the most obvious version of something that ran underneath the whole ranch, like a current she could feel, but not yet see clearly. By the end of the first week, she had a pretty accurate map of it. The older hands. Clem Walt. Big quiet Douglas, who never spoke before. 10 in the morning were watchful but neutral, the kind of neutral that could go either way, depending on what you showed them. The younger ones were uncertain, following each other's lead, the way young men always did, and Pete had been the loudest among them, which meant what Pete thought mattered more than his age suggested. She found out what Pete thought on a Wednesday morning when she came around the corner of the barn too quietly. Don't know why he bothered, Pete was saying low and fast to another hand whose name she hadn't learned yet. Woman like that she ain't going to be any use to. He stopped when he saw her. The color that came up his neck was spectacular. She would have found it funny under other circumstances. Woman like that what, Pete? She said. He said nothing. His jaw worked. I'd rather you finish the thought, she said, than carry it around all day and say it somewhere else later. Still nothing. All right, she said. I'll finish it for you. You looked at me when I came in last week and you decided something, based on my size or my situation, or some combination of the two. She kept her voice level, no heat in it. You decided I was going to be trouble, a burden, something Mr. Whitmore was going to regret. Pete's throat moved. Here's the thing about that, Mabel said. I've been here 7 days. The dairy numbers are already turning. By end of next week, they'll be where they should have been in April. The rotation schedule's fixed. The feed's correcting. She held the young man's gaze. So what I'd suggest, Pete, is that you watch what a person does before you decide what they're worth. Out here, that's the only measure that matters. She walked past him into the barn. Her hands were steady. They always were. She'd learned a long time ago that you didn't let people see where they'd landed. Later that afternoon, Caleb fell into step beside her as she crossed the yard. Pete's going to do better, he said. I know, she said. You handled it right. I handled it the only way I know how. She glanced at him. Did you hear? Enough. You didn't step in. No, he said. I figured you could handle it yourself. A pause. I was right. She thought about that. About the difference between a man who stepped in because you needed him to, and a man who stepped back because he trusted you, didn't. She had experience with the first kind. She did not have much experience with the second. Thank you, she said, for the room, the roof, all of it. You've more than paid for it already, he said. Not yet, she said, but I will. He looked at her sideways. A person isn't measured by what they owe, he said. They're measured by what they do when they don't owe anything. He looked back at the road ahead. You remember that? She was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific thing to say, she said. I'm a specific person. I'm starting to see that, she said. They walked the rest of the yard in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence Mabel Hartwell had experienced in 3 years. Pete came to find her on Saturday morning. He had his hat in his hands, and he stood at the barn door, and he did not look at the ground, which she respected. Ma'am, he said, I want to apologize properly. What you heard me say, it wasn't right. And it wasn't true. And I knew it wasn't true by about the second day, and I've been trying to figure out how to say that ever since. Mabel looked at him. Why'd it take you 5 days? Because I was embarrassed, he said. And being embarrassed made me stubborn. He turned his hat at once in his hands. My mother would have been ashamed of me. I reckon that's what finally did it." Despite herself, Mabel felt the edge of something warm. "What changed your mind, really?" "Watched you work," he said simply. "That's all, just watched." "That's all it takes," she said. "With most things." "Yes, ma'am." He paused. "Those feed numbers this morning were the best since winter. Clem told me." "Clem noticed," she said. "Clem notices everything," Pete said with the tone of a man stating a law of nature. "He just doesn't say it until he's sure." "Apology accepted, Pete," she said. "Now get back to that fence." "Yes, ma'am." He turned to go. "Pete." He stopped. "Your mother raised you right," she said. "Even if it took you 5 days." He laughed then, quick and surprised, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected it, and she watched him walk back across the yard with his hat back on his head, and his shoulders a little straighter, and she thought that sometimes the best thing you could do for a person was let them be better than they'd been yesterday without making them carry the weight of it forever. Old Clem came by the barn on Sunday. He stood at the door for a long time without talking, which she had already learned was just Clem. He processed things at his own pace, and he said things when he was ready and not a moment before. "Rotation schedule's better," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. "I told Mr. Whitmore about it 3 years ago." He paused. He listened. Just didn't know how to move on it. "It's hard to fix something when you're not sure exactly what's wrong," she said. He was quiet again. "You figure on staying." She looked up from the notebook she'd been writing in. "I figure on staying until the homestead's repaired and I can get back to it." Clem looked at her with that old, slow Riverstone expression. "That ain't what I asked," he said. Mabel held his gaze for a moment. "I don't know," she said honestly. Clem nodded, once slow, like she'd given him the right answer. "Caleb's a good man," he said. "In case you were wondering." "I wasn't," she started. "In case you were wondering," he said again, the same pace, like she hadn't spoken, and walked away. She stared after him. Then she looked back at her notebook and realized she hadn't written a word in the last 2 minutes. She went back to work. On Sunday afternoon, she went to the homestead alone. She needed to look at it in clear daylight, needed to assess what the repairs would really cost, needed to stand in the rooms where she and Thomas had built a life, and remind herself what she was working toward. She wished she hadn't gone. The damage was worse than she remembered. The rain had gotten further in than she'd known. The floor in the back room had warped badly. Thomas's corner, the chair, the small shelf he'd built for his 2 books, and his pipe was dark with damp and beginning to give back to the earth. She moved through every room with her notebook. Dimensions, materials, costs, timeline. Precise. Methodical. She kept her pencil moving. At the front door on the way out, she stopped. She put her hand flat against the doorframe. The wood under her palm was dry in the places the sun hit and dark in the places it didn't. "I'm coming back," she said, to the house, to Thomas, to herself. She wasn't sure which, all 3 maybe. "I just need a little more time." She walked back to the Whitmore ranch. Caleb was at the gate when she came up the road. He looked up and he saw her face, and she watched him read something in it. She didn't know what she'd thought. She was holding it well, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He didn't ask. "Coffee's still hot," he said. "Kitchen's empty if you want quiet." She stopped in front of him. "Thank you," she said. "For the coffee, for the not asking, for all of it." She didn't say all of that, but she thought he heard it. "That's a good homestead," he said. "Worth fixing." "I know," she said. "You'll get it back." "I know that too," she said. He nodded. "Go drink your coffee, Mabel." She went. She sat in the empty kitchen with her hands around a hot cup and the late afternoon sun coming through the window, and she was quiet for a long time. Not sad exactly. Not peaceful exactly. Somewhere between the two, the particular stillness of a person who has been holding themselves together very tightly for a very long time and has found without expecting it one small place where they don't have to hold quite so hard. The bread she'd made that morning was still on the table, half gone. She hadn't told anyone to eat it. She'd just left it there. She looked at it now at the empty half, and something in her chest moved. She still didn't trust this. She'd been clear with herself about that. It was too new and too unexpected, and she had too much history with things that looked like safety and turned out to be something else. She was going to stay practical. She was going to stay focused. She was going to repair her homestead and stand back on her own ground and not let herself grow attached to something she didn't know how to hold. But she was warm, and the coffee was good. And somewhere across the yard, Bess was in a clean stall with good feed and proper care, and the roof above Mabel's head was solid in every direction. She pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed. Outside, the ranch went on doing what ranches did, the sound of boots on hard ground, the low voices of men finishing up the day's work, the particular creak and settle of a place that had been built right and had held. Mabel Hartwell sat in the kitchen of a stranger's house and drank her coffee, and did not cry, and did not fall apart, and did not let herself want too much. But she stayed. And staying, she was learning, was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. The morning Mabel found the second problem, she almost didn't say anything. She had been running the dairy barn for 11 days. The feed correction was holding. The rotation schedule was working. Pete did what she told him without argument, and Clem had started leaving his coffee cup on the barn windowsill in the mornings, which she had come to understand was his version of saying good morning, and she had started leaving it filled back up, which was hers. Things were settling. That was exactly what worried her. She had learned in the 3 years since Thomas died that settling was dangerous. Settling meant you stopped watching. Settling meant you started trusting the ground under your feet, and then the ground moved, and you hadn't braced for it, and the falling was worse than it would have been if you'd just stayed tense the whole time. So when she found the second problem, the milk contamination issue, subtle enough that someone who didn't know what they were looking for would have missed it completely, serious enough that if it went uncorrected, it would undo everything she'd fixed in the past 11 days. She stood in the barn for a full 2 minutes, deciding whether to tell Caleb or just fix it herself and say nothing. She told him. She found him in the yard, talking to a man she didn't recognize. Tall, well-dressed in a way that looked deliberate. The kind of deliberate that said money and wanted you to know it. He had his hat in his hands, and he was smiling at Caleb with the particular warmth of a man who wanted something. Caleb saw her coming, and something in his posture shifted a small thing, almost nothing, but she'd been watching him carefully enough by now to notice. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "This is Garrett Holloway. He owns the land east of Red Willow Creek." Holloway turned the smile on her. Up close, it was even more deliberate. "Mrs. Hartwell, I've heard about you." He said it like a compliment. Something about it felt like the opposite. "Have you?" she said. "Word travels in a small territory." He glanced at Caleb. "Whitmore here's got himself quite the arrangement." The word arrangement landed with a particular weight that she did not acknowledge. She looked at Caleb. "I need 5 minutes when you're done," she said. "Dairy issue." "I'm done now," Caleb said immediately. Holloway's smile didn't waver. "Of course. We can finish our conversation another time, Whitmore." He put his hat back on, slow and easy. "You think about what I said." He nodded to Mabel. "Ma'am." He walked away. Mabel watched him go. What did he want? "To buy the east pasture," Caleb said. "Are you selling?" "No." He said it flat, no elaboration. "What's the dairy issue?" she told him. He listened, the way he always listened, still focused, not interrupting. When she finished, he asked 2 questions, both the right ones, and then he said, "How long to fix it?" 3 days if we start this afternoon." "Then we start this afternoon," he said. "What do you need?" She told him that too, and he got her what she needed, and they fixed it, and she did not ask again about Garrett Holloway. But she thought about the way that man had said arrangement. She thought about it more than she wanted to. She was thinking about it 4 days later when she went to town for the first time. She needed linseed oil and 2 specific tools she hadn't been able to find on the ranch. Small things an errand that should have taken an hour. She took the small wagon Caleb told her to use, and she drove herself, and she was back in Red Willow Creek for the first time since she'd been surviving on what was left of her own supplies and hoping nobody noticed. People noticed. She felt it the moment she stepped down from the wagon at the general store, A particular shift in the quality of attention on the main street. The kind you felt on your skin before you could point to its source. Two women she recognized from church stopped their conversation. A man tipping his hat to someone else let his eyes follow her a beat too long. She kept her head up. The general store was owned by a man named Briggs, who had always been perfectly civil to her in the way that people were civil to someone they privately considered unfortunate. He was civil now too, but there was something new in it. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "I need linseed oil and a 12-inch draw knife," she said. "Do you have both?" "I do." He moved to find them. "Heard you've been staying out at the Whitmore place." "I've been working at the Whitmore place," she said. "Is that right?" He said it like a question that wasn't one. "That's right," she said. "Running the dairy operation. The numbers are up significantly from last month if anyone's curious." She kept her voice pleasant. She was very good at pleasant. Briggs set the items on the counter. He named a price. She paid it. And then, because she was already here and there was no point in retreating, she said, "Is there something you want to say to me, Mr. Briggs?" He had the decency to look briefly uncomfortable. "People talk, Mrs. Hartwell, that's all." "People talk about what?" she said. "About a widow who's working honestly for her keep. About a rancher who hired someone who knew the work he needed done." She held his gaze. "I'd be curious to know which part of that is worth talking about." Briggs said nothing. "Thank you for the supplies," she said, and picked them up and walked out. She held it together all the way to the wagon. She held it together, getting the horse settled and checking the ties on the back. She held it together right up until she was sitting on the seat with the reins in her hands and the town behind her and the road to the Whitmore ranch ahead of her. And then her hands shook for exactly 1 minute. She looked at them, watched them shake. Then they stopped because she told them to, and she drove home. Caleb was in the yard when she got back. He read her face the moment she stepped down. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. "Nothing I couldn't handle," she said. "Mabel." She stopped. He didn't use her first name often. When he did, it landed differently. She turned. "People are talking," she said. "About the arrangement." She used Holloway's word deliberately. "About what it means a man like you taking in a woman like me." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," she said. "It matters to my reputation, which is the only thing I've got left that nobody can take a piece of legally." "Nobody is taking anything," he said. "They're talking." "Let them talk," he said. "You know what's true." "I know what's true," she said. "The question is whether anyone else ever will." She looked at him directly. "I want to be clear about something, Caleb. I came here to work and to get back on my feet. That's the whole of it. I don't want anyone thinking it's something else. I don't want you thinking it's something else." He held her gaze. His expression was very steady. "I think exactly what it is," he said. "You came here, you found a problem I couldn't find. You fixed it, and you're still fixing things. That's what I think." A pause. "What other people think is their business." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're a very uncomplicated man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "It's unusual." "Probably," he said. "Go put those supplies away. Supper's in an hour." She went. But she thought about it all through supper and after, and she still hadn't fully settled it in her mind when she blew out the lamp and lay in the dark in her east-facing room, listening to the quiet of a house that held. The talk got louder before it got quieter. She knew it was happening even without going back to town, because she could measure it by the quality of the silences when the ranch hands came back from their days off. Could measure it by the way Walt avoided her eyes for 2 days after a Saturday in town, and then came back around and acted like he hadn't. Could measure it by the afternoon Caleb came in from a supply run with a different quality to his jaw than he'd had when he left. "What happened?" she said, because she'd learned she could ask him things directly. "Holloway's been talking," Caleb said. He set down the supplies he'd brought back, and he looked at her. "He's been telling people you came out here under false pretenses. That you're not actually working. That I've been—" He stopped. "That you've been what?" she said. "Taking advantage of you," he said. "Which is backwards." and everyone with any sense knows it. But Holloway's got a loud voice and a lot of connections. Mabel was very still. Why would he care? He doesn't know me. He does actually, Caleb said. Or he did. Before Thomas died, Holloway tried to buy your homestead property 3 times. Thomas turned him down every time. She stared at him. I didn't know that. Thomas probably didn't want to worry you. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down, which meant he wasn't done, which meant there was more. She sat down too. Your homestead sits on top of the best water rights on this side of Red Willow Creek, Caleb said. Whoever owns that property controls the water access for 4 neighboring ranches, including mine. Holloway's been trying to get control of that water for 6 years. He looked at her. With you struggling and alone, and now seemingly, he paused. Now seemingly dependent on a man who also has water interests, he's trying to create a story that discredits you, that makes you look like you're not managing your own affairs. Mabel felt something go very cold in her chest. So that when the back taxes come due, there'll be nobody who'll take your side when you try to fight it, Caleb said. She sat with that for a moment. Are there back taxes? I don't know for certain, he said, but I think you should find out. I think you should find out soon. She stood up. I need to go to the county land office. I know, he said. I'll take you tomorrow. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. I'm going to. She looked at him across the table. This man who had handed her cow back and given her a room and a title and the dignity of being told she'd earned her place. This man who told her things she needed to know without dressing them up as things she should be grateful for. Caleb, she said. Why does it matter to you? She said. What happens to my property, my situation? None of this is your problem. He was quiet for a moment. It became my problem, he said slowly. The morning you walked through my gate. That's just how it is. He stood up. 7 o'clock tomorrow. We'll take the wagon. He walked out. Mabel sat at the table alone and thought about the word became. How he'd said it. Like a thing that had simply happened, like weather, like the seasons turning, like a fact of the territory that didn't require explanation or apology. She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was not going to make something out of nothing. She was practical. She was focused. She had a problem in front of her that required attention and clear thinking, and she was going to give it exactly that. But her hands were warm where they pressed against the wood, and she let them stay. The county land office was a small square building in the center of Red Willow Creek that smelled like old paper and ambition, and the man behind the main desk was named Farnsworth, who had the expression of someone who had decided his job was to make everything as difficult as possible and had found genuine happiness in it. He looked at Mabel when she came in. Then he looked at Caleb behind her. Then back at Mabel. Mrs. Hartwell, he said. What can I do for you? I need to see the tax records for my homestead property, she said. The Hartwell parcel on the west side of Red Willow Creek. Farnsworth moved to the files with the deliberate slowness of a man who wanted you to understand he was doing you a favor by moving at all. He pulled a folder and set it on the counter and opened it and turned it so she could see. Mabel looked at the numbers. These are wrong, she said. Farnsworth blinked. I beg your pardon. These numbers are wrong, she said. She turned the folder so Caleb could see. She put her finger on the entry for March. This assessment value. Thomas paid taxes on this property every year for 6 years, and the assessed value was consistent. This number is 3 times what it was assessed at in 1882. She looked up at Farnsworth. Who changed the assessment? Farnsworth's expression went careful. Assessments are reviewed periodically. By who? Mabel said. I want the name of the assessor who reviewed this property, and when they did it, and on what basis they tripled the value. Mrs. Hartwell, I think very clearly, Mr. Farnsworth, she said. I'd like the name. Caleb stepped up beside her. Not in front of her, beside her. His arms were crossed and his voice was very quiet when he spoke. The lady asked a direct question, he said. It deserves a direct answer. Farnsworth looked at Caleb for a moment. Something shifted in his calculation. I'll have to look into the review record, Farnsworth said. We'll wait, Mabel said. They waited. It took Farnsworth 11 minutes, which was 9 minutes longer than it should have taken, which told Mabel something about what he was doing with those 11 minutes that had nothing to do with looking. When he came back, he had a secondary folder. He set it on the counter. He did not open it. The review was conducted in January of this year, he said. The assessor's name is listed as H. Crawley. Who is H. Crawley? Mabel said. Farnsworth said nothing. Mr. Farnsworth, she said. Who is H. Crawley? He does assessment work for several landowners in the territory. Mabel looked at him. Which landowners? The silence was its own answer. Garrett Holloway, she said. It was not a question. Farnsworth said nothing. Caleb's jaw was tight. He kept his voice even. Is there a formal process for contesting an assessment? He said. There is, Farnsworth said unhappily. Then we'll be filing one, Caleb said. Today. Whatever forms are required, bring them out. Farnsworth brought the forms. Mabel filled them out. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried, every letter exactly where it should be, which was the only way she knew how to be furious about something, by doing the next right thing with total control, because the alternative was to feel the full scope of what was happening, and she was not going to do that in front of this man. When she handed the completed forms back, Farnsworth looked at them, then at her. The process can take some time, he said. I'm patient, she said, but not infinitely. She picked up her copy of the filing. Good day, Mr. Farnsworth. She walked out. On the street she stopped. The sun was high and the town was moving around her, and she stood very still for a moment with the paper in her hand. He's been planning this, she said. Yes, Caleb said. Since Thomas died. Probably before, he said. Just waiting for the right moment. She thought about that. About Garrett Holloway watching from across the territory, patient and deliberate, waiting for the widow to run out of options. Watching the roof collapse. Watching the money drain. Watching and waiting for the moment when she'd be isolated enough, desperate enough that there'd be nobody left who would stand up and say the assessment was fraudulent. He nearly had me, she said quietly. He didn't, Caleb said. Nearly, she said again. Because that was true, and she believed in being honest about true things, even when they were uncomfortable. She had nearly walked into this man's trap without knowing it existed. Caleb looked at her. What do you want to do? I want to find every document Thomas ever kept about this property, she said. Every tax receipt, every survey record, every piece of paper he ever signed with that land on it. She looked at Caleb. He kept everything. He was meticulous. I know exactly where it is. Then we go get it, Caleb said. Now. Right now, he said. He started toward the wagon. Mabel walked beside him. She was not afraid. She was past afraid. There was something happening on the other side of fear, a particular clarity that came from finally seeing the whole shape of a problem after too long, seeing only parts of it. She knew this feeling. It was the same feeling she got in the dairy barn when all the pieces lined up, when the math resolved and the solution appeared, and everything that had seemed complicated suddenly revealed itself as simple. The homestead was quiet when they got there. Mabel went directly to the back room, to the corner where the floor had warped, but the small chest Thomas had built into the wall had stayed dry because he'd put extra tar on the seams. She'd known it was there. She just needed a reason to open it. She opened it. Inside. Thomas Hartwell had kept 6 years of receipts, surveys, correspondence, and assessment records in a tied bundle that smelled like cedar and old ink. Every tax payment, every survey marker, every letter from the county office, every single piece of paper that touched that property, dated, organized, signed. Mabel put her hand on the bundle and felt something move through her chest that had Thomas's name on it. Found it, she said. Caleb was at the doorway. He looked at what she was holding. That's everything you need, he said. It's everything anyone would need, she said. To prove that the 1884 assessment is fraudulent. That the property's been falsely valued to generate back taxes that wouldn't otherwise exist. She looked up. Thomas knew something like this might happen. He kept everything. Smart man, Caleb said. The smartest, she said. Her voice was steady. He always said if someone tries to take what's yours, make sure you've got the paper that says it's yours. Make sure you've got it written down. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He looked at her, and she could see him deciding whether to ask something, and then deciding not to. Let's get that back to the ranch, he said. I want to look through it with you before you take it to anyone. You know land law, she said. I know enough, he said. And I know a lawyer in Billings who knows more than enough. She looked at him. This is going to be a fight. Yes, he said. Holloway's got connections, money, people who'll say what he pays them to say. Yes, he said again. And you've got 6 years of your husband's handwriting and a stack of receipts and the truth. He met her eyes. In my experience, the truth is stubborn. It tends to outlast money. Mabel looked at the bundle in her hands. Then she looked at the room around her, the warped floor, the dark corner where Thomas's chair had been the ceiling that opened onto sky where it had once been solid. She thought about Thomas building this chest into the wall. She thought about him going through that bundle every year, keeping it tidy, keeping it ready, knowing that the land was worth protecting, and that protection required patience and paper and the willingness to fight clean. She thought about the woman who had walked 3 miles in August heat with a cow on a rope prepared to give everything away just to get through another winter. That woman had not known about the bundle in the wall. She knew now. She tucked it under her arm. Let's go, she said. They drove back in the late afternoon with the bundle on the seat between them, and Mabel kept her hand on it the whole way, the way you kept your hand on something you weren't going to let go of. Caleb drove and didn't talk much, which was fine. She didn't need talking. She needed to think, and she thought better in quiet, and he seemed to understand that without her saying it. When they got back to the ranch, Hank was waiting at the gate with an expression that meant news, and not good news. Someone was here, Hank said. While you were in town, asking questions about the property, about Mrs. Hartwell's property. He looked uncomfortable. It was one of Holloway's men. Mabel and Caleb looked at each other. What kind of questions? Caleb said. About whether she'd been making improvements to the land, whether there'd been any work done on the homestead recently. Hank paused. I didn't tell him anything, but he already seemed to know she'd been out there. Someone had been watching the homestead, watching her come and go. Mabel pressed the bundle against her side. He's moving faster, she said. Because he knows you're not isolated anymore, Caleb said. He was looking at the road, not at her, but his voice had a particular quality to it, not angry, not loud, just very certain. He counted on you being alone. He didn't count on this. On what? She said. He looked at her then. On you having somebody in your corner, he said. She held his gaze. The late afternoon light was doing something complicated to the yard, and Bess was lowing somewhere in the barn, and the ranch was settling into evening around them, and Mabel Hartwell stood in the middle of all of it, with 6 years of her dead husband's careful record-keeping under her arm, and a man she had known for less than 3 weeks looking at her like she was something worth standing next to. She looked away first. We need to write to the lawyer tonight, she said. Tonight, he agreed. And I want copies made of everything in this bundle before it goes anywhere. Smart, he said. Thomas taught me that, she said. Keep your own copy, always. They walked inside. Mabel set the bundle on the kitchen table and untied the cord and spread the papers out and began to organize them by year, by type, by date. Caleb lit the lamp and pulled up a chair across from her and picked up the first survey record and read it without comment. They worked like that for 2 hours. Side by side across the table, her sorting and him reading, the lamp between them and the night coming in at the windows. And it was the most companionable 2 hours Mabel could remember in a long time, which she noted with the same careful caution she applied to everything and set aside. At the end of it, Caleb set down the last receipt and looked at the organized stacks between them. He doesn't have a case, he said. Not against this. Not if we can get it in front of the right person, Mabel said. We'll get it there, he said. He looked at her. You're not going to lose this property. She looked back at him. You sound very certain. I am certain, he said, because I've been sitting here watching you work for 2 hours, and I'll tell you straight, Mabel, I would not want to be on the other side of you in a fight. Not for any amount of money Holloway's got. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to take that as a compliment, she said. It was meant as one, he said. She began gathering the papers to retie the bundle. Her hands were steady. They were always steady, but there was a different quality to the steadiness tonight. Less the steadiness of control, more the steadiness of solid ground. Caleb, she said. When this is over, she said carefully. When the property's sorted, and the fraud's been proven, and I'm back on my own feet, I want you to know that I'm aware of what this has cost you. Your time, your reputation, people talking about you because of me. He was quiet for a moment. My reputation, he said, can handle the weight of doing the right thing. He stood up. And your gratitude is noted, but I didn't do any of this for gratitude. He picked up the lamp to carry it out. I told you on the first day. Somebody should have helped before now. This is just what should have happened. He walked out of the kitchen. Mabel sat alone at the table with the tied bundle in front of her, and the dark outside the window, and the warm smell of the lamp still in the air. She pressed her fingers against the cord around the bundle. She had walked into this ranch with one cow and a prepared speech, and the absolute firm intention of staying practical, of staying safe, of not letting anything become more than what it was, a trade, a temporary shelter, a working arrangement between two people who needed something from each other. She was still being practical. She was still being careful. But she was starting to understand that careful and closed were not the same thing. That you could protect yourself without sealing every door. That a person could let something in, let it in slowly, let it in carefully, let it in only after it had proven itself worth the risk without falling apart. Thomas had known that. Thomas had been the most careful, steady, patient man she'd ever known, and he had walked up to her at a church social in 1879 and said, I believe this dance is yours if you'd like it. And she had said yes, and she had never regretted it. She was not thinking about Caleb Whitmore that way. She was not. But she pressed her hand flat over the bundle and felt the solidity of 6 years of Thomas's careful work under her palm, and she thought he would have liked Caleb. He would have said that man knows what matters. He would have said that's the kind of man worth knowing. She blew out the last lamp in the kitchen and went to bed. Outside, the territory settled into its night sounds, and somewhere across the yard, Bess shifted in her stall, and the roof above Mabel's head was solid in every direction. She closed her eyes. She had a fight coming. It was going to be real and difficult, and she was going to have to stand in front of people who had already decided something about her and make them see differently. She knew that. She was not afraid of it. She was in fact already thinking about exactly what she was going to say. The letter from the lawyer in Billings arrived on a Thursday, and it was not good news. Mabel was in the dairy barn when Caleb came to find her. She knew from the way he walked, not slow, not fast, but deliberate in a way that meant he'd already read it and was deciding how to hand it to her, that whatever was in the envelope was going to change the shape of things. She set down the milk pail and wiped her hands. Tell me, she said. He handed her the letter. Read it yourself. I don't want to translate something you should hear in the original. She read it. The lawyer's name was Edmund Grice, and he wrote in the precise, unhurried language of a man who charged by the word and wanted you to know he'd earned every one of them. The substance of it was this: the fraudulent assessment was provable. Thomas's records were more than sufficient. Under normal circumstances, the case would be straightforward. These were not normal circumstances. Garrett Holloway had filed a counterclaim 2 days before their letter reached Grice's office. He was claiming that Mabel had abandoned the property, that her departure to the Whitmore Ranch constituted legal abandonment under territorial statute, and that the unpaid taxes combined with abandonment gave the county grounds to move toward a tax sale. A tax sale that Holloway's name was already attached to as the prospective buyer. Mabel lowered the letter. He knew, she said. He knew we were going to contest, so he moved first. His man was watching the homestead, Caleb said. When he saw you'd left, he filed the abandonment claim the next morning. Can he do that? She said. Can he make that stick? Grice says it's thin, Caleb said. But thin isn't the same as wrong. In front of the right judge with the right pressure, it could hold long enough for the tax sale to go through. And once the sale goes through, it doesn't matter if we prove the fraud afterward, Mabel said, because the land's already gone. Yes, he said. She folded the letter. She folded it precisely along its original creases the way Thomas had taught her to fold documents you intended to keep. She held it for a moment. How long do we have, she said. The hearing's in 3 weeks, Caleb said. County Commissioner's office. It's not a full court proceeding, it's an administrative hearing, which means the evidentiary standard is lower, but so is the formality. Grice says you'll need to appear in person. Of course I'll appear in person, she said. And Holloway will be there, Caleb said, with his lawyer and his assessor, and probably half the county commission in his pocket. Mabel looked at him. Are you trying to discourage me? No, he said. I'm trying to make sure you know exactly what you're walking into. I know exactly what I'm walking into, she said. I've known what kind of man Garrett Holloway is since the moment he said the word arrangement. She tucked the letter into her apron pocket. What I need now is to know who else he's done this to. Caleb went still. What, she said. Why do you think he's done it to others? Because men like Holloway don't practice on one person, she said. They build systems, they find what works, and they repeat it. The fraudulent assessor, the abandonment claim, the tax sale, that's not improvised. That's practiced. She looked at Caleb steadily. Who else has lost land on this side of Red Willow Creek in the past 3 years? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the Brennan widow. Southeast quarter she sold in 1882. People said she got a fair price, but she left town inside a month, which never sat right with me. The McCready homestead abandoned in '83 tax sale in the spring. And old Joseph Farr, who everyone said just couldn't manage the land alone after his sons moved on. He paused. 3 properties, all on water access routes. All bought by Holloway, she said. All bought by holding companies, he said. But Grice might be able to. Grice needs to look at all 3, Mabel said. If there's a pattern, if the same assessor touched those properties, then this isn't just my fight. This is evidence of a scheme that's been running for years. She pulled out her notebook. She carried it everywhere now, an old habit from the dairy work that had become something larger. Write down every name you just said, dates, properties, whatever you remember. Caleb sat down on the hay bale behind him. He took the notebook she held out. He looked at it for a moment. Mabel, he said, if you make this bigger than your property, if you go after the pattern instead of just your own case, Holloway's going to come at you harder. I know, she said. He's got money and connections and people who'll say whatever he needs said. I know that too, she said. And you're a plus-size widow who's been living on a man's ranch for less than a month, which is the story he's going to tell when he needs to make you look unreliable. I know exactly what story he's going to tell, she said. Let him tell it. Stories run out when the paper says different. She met his eyes. Write down the names, Caleb. He wrote down the names. That evening she wrote to Grice with the new information. She wrote clearly, specifically, with dates and names and property locations. And at the end of the letter she wrote, I believe this is a pattern of fraud targeting isolated landowners on water access routes. I am prepared to make this case at the hearing. Please advise on what additional documentation will strengthen the argument for all 3 prior cases, not only my own. She sealed the letter and gave it to Pete to take to town first thing in the morning. Then she went back to work. The next day, Garrett Holloway came to the ranch. She was crossing the yard when she heard the wagon, and she turned, and there he was, same deliberate hat, same practiced smile, same quality of a man who had calculated his welcome before he arrived. He had another man with him this time, younger. The kind of young man who was hired to stand next to someone and make them look like they had weight. Caleb came out of the house before Holloway had finished tying his horse. Holloway, Caleb said. He did not say it warmly. Whitmore. Holloway's smile didn't shift. And Mrs. Hartwell. Good timing. He looked at her in that particular way, measuring like a man at an auction, trying not to look interested. I was hoping to have a word. You can have several, Mabel said. They'll all get the same answer. Holloway chuckled. It was a performed chuckle, the kind people deployed when they wanted you to think they found you charming rather than inconvenient. I appreciate the spirit, ma'am. I genuinely do. He looked at Caleb. I came to make a fair offer, Whitmore. For the Hartwell property. A real offer, what the land's actually worth. The land's worth considerably more than your assessor said it was, Mabel said. Holloway looked at her with something that was almost respect. Almost. Mrs. Hartwell, the legal situation around your property is going to become very complicated very fast. I've been in this territory long enough to know how these proceedings go. The county commission is busy, the timeline is tight, and widows who haven't lived on their property for... I haven't abandoned my property, Mabel said. I've been working. There's a difference. And we both know your abandonment claim doesn't hold. Holloway's smile thinned. Just slightly. Just enough. Bold talk, he said, for a woman in your position. Living on another man's charity, he said. Dependent on his goodwill. No income of your own, no clear legal standing. I have legal standing, she said. I have 6 years of tax receipts, original survey records, and correspondence that documents every assessment my husband ever received. I also have the name of your assessor and 3 other properties he touched before mine, and a lawyer in Billings who is currently reviewing all of it. She kept her voice even. Conversational almost. So when you say my position, I want to be clear about what position I'm actually in. Holloway looked at her. The smile was completely gone now. Those other properties have nothing to do with your case, he said. Maybe, she said. Maybe not. I guess we'll find out at the hearing. Something moved in Holloway's eyes. It was fast, and he controlled it fast, but she saw it. Saw the calculation shift. Saw him reassessing something he'd thought was settled. I'd encourage you to think carefully, he said. His voice was still smooth, but the warmth had gone out of it entirely. A prolonged legal dispute is expensive, it's time-consuming, it's stressful, and the outcome is never as certain as people hope. He looked at Caleb. Whitmore, you're a reasonable man. Talk to her. Caleb looked at Holloway for a long moment. Then he said, Mrs. Hartwell's handling her own affairs. I don't talk for her. A pause. She doesn't need me to. Holloway looked between them. Something settled in his face, the final drop of the performance. You're making a mistake, he said to Mabel. I've made mistakes, she said. Staying quiet while you ran this scheme for 3 years isn't going to be one of them. She held his gaze. You should go now, Mr. Holloway. You've got a hearing to prepare for. He left. Nobody said anything until the wagon was out of sight. Then Pete, who had apparently been at the corner of the barn this whole time, said, Lord Almighty, very quietly to no one in particular. Clem, who was somewhere behind Mabel, said, which she had come to understand was his version of a standing ovation. Caleb looked at her. You all right, he said. I'm better than all right, she said. And she meant it. Her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. She felt the particular aliveness of a person who has been waiting for a fight to go honest and has finally watched it do exactly that. He's scared. Did you see it? I saw it, Caleb said. He didn't expect the other properties, she said. He didn't expect me to have already put that together. He came here thinking he could rattle me into settling, and now he knows that's not going to work, and he's got 2 weeks to figure out a new approach. She looked at Caleb. What's he going to do? He's going to try to discredit you, Caleb said immediately. Before the hearing, he's going to make as much noise as possible about your situation, about you living here, about us. He paused briefly. About the appearance of things. He's going to try to make the commission see you as someone whose judgment can't be trusted. Then we need to be ahead of that, she said. How? She thought for a moment. I need to go back to the homestead, visibly. People need to see me working on it. Actually working, improving it, not abandoned. If there's a question of abandonment, there needs to be very public evidence that contradicts it. She looked at him. And I need to talk to the Brennan widow if I can find her, and anyone connected to the McCready property, if there are people who'll say what happened to them. That's a lot to do in 2 weeks, Caleb said. Then I'd better start today, she said. She started that afternoon. She borrowed tools from the ranch and drove herself to the homestead and spent 4 hours doing the most visible repair work she could manage alone. Clearing debris, stabilizing the remaining structure, starting the work on the collapsed roof section. She wasn't a carpenter, she knew that. But she knew enough to do something, and something was what the situation required. Walt showed up 2 hours in without explanation, and began working on the roof section without being asked. She looked at him. "Figured you could use a hand," he said without stopping work. She turned back to what she was doing. "Thank you, Walt." He said, which apparently was contagious on the Whitmore ranch. By the time she drove back in the evening, Douglas had also been there and gone, leaving a neat stack of salvageable lumber that he'd clearly sorted while she wasn't paying attention. She looked at the stack for a long moment before she climbed back in the wagon. She did not know what to do with this. With men, she barely knew showing up to help without being asked. It was not something she had experienced much of in the years since Thomas died, and the unfamiliarity of it sat in her chest in a way that required careful handling. She handled it by driving home and making supper and not mentioning it. Caleb noticed she didn't mention it. She could see him noticing. He let it go, which was the right choice. 3 days later, the rumors hit. She had expected them. She'd told herself she was prepared. But there was a difference between knowing a thing was coming and standing in the middle of it when it arrived, and the version of it that arrived was worse than she'd specifically imagined because it came through the voice she least expected. It was the minister's wife. Mrs. Alderman was a woman. Mabel had known for 4 years, had sat beside in church for 4 years, had exchanged recipes with and spoken to after services, and considered if not a close friend, then at least an honest one. She appeared at the ranch on a Wednesday morning with a covered dish and an expression that meant she had come with purpose. "Mabel," she said when they were seated in the kitchen, "I came because I care about your situation, because people are talking, and it's not kind talk, and I think you deserve to know what's being said." "Tell me," Mabel said. Mrs. Alderman told her. The story Holloway's people had been circulating was precise and poisonous, that Mabel Hartwell had not gone to the Whitmore ranch to work, but to secure a protector. That the arrangement was not professional, but personal. That she had manufactured the situation to compromise the rancher into supporting her land claim. That a woman of her appearance and circumstances had no other means of obtaining a man's backing, so she had found alternative currency. Mabel sat with that for a long moment. "That's the story," she said. "I don't believe it," Mrs. Alderman said quickly. "I want you to know that. But people are listening. Mabel and Garrett Holloway has been very persuasive." "Of course he has," Mabel said. "It's a very efficient story. It attacks my character. It suggests Mr. Whitmore's support is compromised, and it uses my appearance against me in a way that makes it seem like common sense rather than cruelty." She looked at Mrs. Alderman. "Do you know who's been repeating it?" Mrs. Alderman named 4 names. Mabel wrote them down. "What are you going to do?" Mrs. Alderman said. "I'm going to the hearing," Mabel said. "And I'm going to let the paper say what it says." "But Mabel, if people go into that hearing already believing, then I'll change their minds when I get there," Mabel said. She said it quietly. She said it like something she had already decided. "Mrs. Alderman, I have been managing this land alone for 3 years. I walked into that barn and diagnosed a problem in an hour that 3 men couldn't find in 3 months. I have 6 years of tax receipts and an original survey and the name of a fraudulent assessor who touched 4 properties before mine." She folded her hands on the table. "The question is not whether I'm capable. The question is whether people are willing to see it. And I can't control that. But I can control what I do in front of them when it matters." Mrs. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. "You've changed," she said. "Since Thomas died, you've gotten harder." "Clearer," Mabel said. "There's a difference." That evening she told Caleb what Mrs. Alderman had said. All of it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry. That story, what it implies about you, that's not right." "No," she said. "It's not, but it's strategic." She looked at him. "Caleb, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." All right, he said. Does my being here make this harder for you, your reputation, your business? The way people in this territory see you, does my situation complicate things you don't need complicated? He looked at her for a long moment. A real look, the kind that meant he was giving the question its full weight. No, he said. Be honest. I am honest, he said. People have been saying things about me my whole life. Said I was cold, said I was strange for not marrying, said I cared more about land than people. He held her gaze. I've never changed what I did based on what people said. I'm not starting now. A pause. But I want to ask you something back. All right, she said. Does it bother you, he said. What they're saying about us. Not about your reputation in the abstract, about the specific thing they're implying. He said it carefully. Does it bother you because it's false, or does it bother you for a different reason? The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at him. That's a very specific question, she said. I'm a specific person, he said. It was the same thing he'd said before, the same words, but the weight behind them was different now. She held his gaze. I'll answer that question, she said, after the hearing. When everything else is settled and I'm standing on my own ground again, then I'll answer it. He nodded. Slow. Fair enough, he said. They went back to work. The week before the hearing, Grice's second letter arrived. This one was better. He had found the connection. H. Crawley, the fraudulent assessor, had signed documents touching all three prior properties: the Brennan widow's land, the McCready homestead, and the Farr property. In all three cases, the assessment had been inflated by similar margins in the year before the tax sale. In all three cases, the buying entity traced back to a holding company whose directors included Garrett Holloway. It was not just a pattern, it was a system. Grice wrote, "In my professional opinion, this evidence presented alongside Mrs. Hartwell's original records constitutes a compelling case not only for dismissal of the current claim, but for investigation of fraudulent practice in all four properties. I am prepared to present this at the hearing and recommend we request that the County Commission forward the matter to the Territorial Attorney General's office." Mabel read the letter twice. Then she found Caleb in the barn and handed it to him without saying anything. He read it. When he looked up, there was something in his face that she had not seen there before. It was not quite surprise. It was the look of a man who had believed something would work out and was experiencing the specific feeling of being right. "He didn't count on you going after the others," he said. "No," she said. "He thought I'd be too focused on my own situation to look sideways." She took the letter back. Men like that always think women in trouble have tunnel vision. That survival makes you narrow. "It can," Caleb said. "It can also make you very, very clear," she said. The day before the hearing, something happened that Mabel had not planned for and did not know how to hold. She had been at the homestead again. The work was coming along. Walt and Douglas had been out twice more, and the roof section was nearly sound when she heard a wagon coming up the road. It was not anyone from the Whitmore ranch. It was the Brennan widow. Her name was Clara, and she was perhaps 60, small and spare, with the look of someone who had been through something real and had come out the other side of it, slightly translucent. She stopped the wagon and looked at Mabel and said, "You're the Hartwell woman." "I am," Mabel said. "I heard what you're doing," Clara said. "What you found. About Crawley and the assessments." She looked at her hands on the reins for a moment. "I knew something was wrong when I sold. The price was bad, and the pressure was, there was a lot of pressure. And I was alone, and I didn't have anyone telling me I could fight it." She looked at Mabel. "I want to come to the hearing, if it would help." Mabel looked at her for a long moment. "It would help," she said. "It would help a great deal." "Then I'll be there," Clara said. "I've been quiet about this for 2 years, and I am done being quiet." She gathered her reins. "You're braver than I was, Mrs. Hartwell." "I had more help than you did," Mabel said. "That's the only difference." Clara Brennan nodded and drove away. Mabel stood in the yard and watched her go, and felt something settle in her chest that was larger than the hearing, larger than the property, larger than the legal case she'd been building. It had to do with the specific loneliness of being a woman in trouble with no one to stand next to, and what happened when that changed. When someone looked at you and said, "I'll be there," and meant it. She thought about 3 weeks ago. About the rope in her hand, and the cow at her side, and the way she'd walked into Caleb Whitmore's yard, fully prepared to lose the last good thing she owned. She pressed her hand against the repaired doorframe of her homestead. It held. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table at the Whitmore Ranch and went through Thomas's documents one final time. Every receipt, every letter, every date and number and signature. She knew them all by now, knew them the way you knew a piece of music after you'd played it enough times. Not just the notes, but the space between them, the places where a person who was paying attention would hear something. Caleb came in at 9. He looked at the spread of papers and then at her face. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she said. And she was. She was more ready than she had been for anything in 3 years. She was made of her husband's careful paper, and Clara Brennan's courage, and 6 weeks of proving herself in a barn, and the particular fury of a woman who has been patient long enough. "Get some sleep," Caleb said. "I will," she said. "In a minute." He started to go. "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know that walking through your gate was the best decision I've made since Thomas died." She said it straightforwardly, without decoration. "I want you to know that." He turned. He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen, across the spread of Thomas's careful documents, across the 3 weeks of everything they'd built between them, without quite naming it. "Get some sleep, Mabel," he said. But he said it gently. And the way he said it told her something she filed away carefully, something she intended to come back to on the other side of tomorrow when the ground was settled under her feet again, and she could afford to look at things straight. She gathered Thomas's papers. She was ready. The county commissioner's office was a single room that smelled like pipe tobacco and old decisions, and it was full by the time Mabel arrived. She had not expected that. She had expected Holloway's people. She had expected Farnsworth from the land office, and the commissioner himself, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pratt, who had the look of someone who had made a career out of appearing neutral while being nothing of the sort. She had expected Grice, who had arrived the night before from Billings, and had spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with her going through every document one final time, asking questions she already knew the answers to because he wanted to hear how she answered them in front of a room. What she had not expected was the room itself. Clara Brennan was already seated in the second row when Mabel walked in. She had come alone, small and straight-backed, with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set in the way of a woman who has decided something and is not going to undecide it. She looked at Mabel when she entered and gave one firm nod. Behind Clara sat 2 men. Mabel didn't recognize. Grice had told her the night before that he'd sent word to the families connected to the McCready property. She hadn't known whether anyone would come. They had come. Along the sidewall, she saw Clem, Walt, Douglas, Pete standing in the back with his hat in his hands. They had not told her they were coming. Not one of them had said a word about it. They were just there the way good people sometimes simply appeared in the places they were needed without announcement or explanation. She stopped walking for just a moment. She made herself keep moving. Caleb was at the front, already seated beside the chair Grice had reserved for her. He looked up when she came in. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just looked at her in that direct, steady way of his, and she sat down beside him and put Thomas's documents on the table in front of her and breathed once. Holloway was across the aisle with his lawyer, a man named Voss, who had the expensive, unhurried look of someone flown in from somewhere larger. Holloway's assessor, H. Crawley, sat behind them, a thin man with the expression of someone who had recently understood that the room he was in was significantly more dangerous than the room he'd been promised. Commissioner Pratt called the hearing to order. "This is an administrative proceeding," Pratt said, "regarding the Hartwell property on the west side of Red Willow Creek. We're here to hear the county's abandonment claim and the contesting party's response." He looked at Holloway's lawyer first. Mabel noted that. "Mr. Voss, you may proceed." Voss stood. He was smooth and practiced the kind of lawyer who made complicated things sound simple and simple things sound complicated, depending on which direction served him. He laid out the county's case, such as it was in 15 minutes. Mrs. Hartwell had vacated the property, had not maintained residence, had not paid the adjusted taxes, and under territorial statute, the combination of unpaid taxes and non-residence constituted grounds for a tax sale proceeding. He did not mention Holloway once. He spoke about the county's interest in settled, maintained land. He spoke about the importance of tax revenue for territorial development. He was very good. When he sat down, Mabel looked at Grice. Grice stood up. He was shorter than Voss and less polished, and had ink on his left cuff, which she had noticed the night before and which she found unexpectedly reassuring. He looked like a man who worked. He put one piece of paper on the table in front of him and left everything else in the folder. "Commissioner Pratt," he said, "the contesting party will demonstrate 3 things. First, that Mrs. Hartwell did not abandon the Hartwell property under any reasonable interpretation of territorial statute. Second, that the tax assessment, which forms the basis of the unpaid tax claim, is fraudulent, having been conducted by an assessor with a direct financial relationship to the prospective buyer. And third—" He paused, and Mabel heard the room shift slightly, heard the quality of attention change. "That this is not an isolated case. That the same assessor working in connection with the same financial interests has been used to manufacture fraudulent claims against at least 3 other properties in this territory over the past 3 years." The room went very quiet. Holloway didn't move. Voss wrote something on the paper in front of him. Pratt looked up. "That's a significant claim, Counselor." "It is," Grice said, "and I have the documentation to support it." Pratt looked at Voss. "Any objection to the scope of presentation?" Voss said pleasantly. "None at all." "Commissioner, we're confident the record will speak for itself." He said it like a man who wasn't worried. Mabel watched Holloway's face when Voss said that, and she saw just briefly the thing she'd seen in the yard when she'd mentioned the other properties that fast-controlled recalibration. He was worried. He was simply better at not showing it than most people. Grice called her first. She stood, and the room rearranged itself in her awareness. The faces along the wall, the weight of Thomas's documents in her hands, the particular feeling of a moment that had been building for 3 years without her knowing it. She thought about the woman who had stood in this town's general store and been called unfortunate with someone's eyes while their mouth said something civil. She thought about the roof coming down. She thought about the 3-mile walk and the rope in her hand. Then she thought about Thomas writing receipts at the kitchen table by lamplight, careful and steady, keeping everything. She answered Grice's questions. She was precise. She was specific. She did not editorialize. When Grice asked her to describe the condition of the property when she left it, and her reasons for leaving, she said, "The roof collapsed in a storm. I went to find work that would allow me to earn the materials needed to repair it. I did not sell the property. I did not give up the property. I made arrangements to maintain it while I worked." She held up the documentation of her visits to the homestead. "I returned to the property 9 times in the 6 weeks I was away. I have dated notes from each visit and 2 witnesses who accompanied me on repairs." Grice entered the documents. Then Voss stood for his cross-examination. He was pleasant about it. He always was. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "you mentioned you went to find work. You went to the Whitmore Ranch." "Yes," she said. "And Mr. Whitmore, he's present today." "He is," she said. "Can you describe the nature of your arrangement at the Whitmore Ranch?" The word arrangement again. She heard it land in the room, felt the shift. "I managed the dairy operation," she said. "I identified a feed problem that had been affecting milk volume for months. I restructured the rotation schedule. I implemented a tracking system for daily production. In 6 weeks, output has increased by 40%. She held Voss's gaze. "That is the arrangement." "And in exchange," Voss said pleasantly, "room and board," she said, "which I've earned. Mr. Whitmore pays you no wages. We agreed on room and board as initial compensation while the dairy numbers recovered," she said. "There is a wage agreement in place beginning next month." Voss nodded slowly. A woman living on a man's property, no formal wage dependent on his goodwill and his support at this very hearing. "Objection," Grice said. "Counsel is characterizing, not questioning." Pratt looked at Voss. Ask a question, counselor. Voss smiled. Of course. Mrs. Hartwell, is it fair to say that Mr. Whitmore's support of your case, his presence here today, his financial backing of legal counsel? Mr. Whitmore did not pay for legal counsel, Mabel said. I did, from my wages. She watched something flicker in Voss's expression. I kept account of every cent. I have the ledger if the commissioner would like to see it. Pratt looked at her, then at Voss. Do you have further questions for this witness, counselor? Voss looked at his notes. He had been expecting a different version of her, the version Holloway had described, the isolated widow, the dependent woman who needed a man's voice to be heard. He had prepared for that version. He was recalibrating. Not at this time, he said. Mabel sat down. Caleb leaned slightly toward her. He didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He just leaned a fraction of an inch, barely perceptible, and she felt it, and she let herself feel it, and then she turned her attention back to the front of the room. Grice called the assessor next. H. Crawley walked to the front of the room with the expression of a man walking to a gallows. He'd been assured was just a fence. He was thin and 50-ish, and had the look of someone who had told himself for a long time that what he did was just business, and was now in this particular room finding that story slightly harder to maintain. Grice did not waste time. Mr. Crawley, he said, you conducted the 1884 assessment of the Hartwell property. I did, Crawley said. You assessed it at 3 times the previous valuation. The market. The market moved uniformly in this territory, Grice said. I have comparable assessments from 14 properties in the same county conducted in the same period. None of them show an increase greater than 12%. You assessed the Hartwell property at 280% of its previous value. He set the comparison sheet on the table. Can you explain that discrepancy? Crawley was quiet. Mr. Crawley, Grice said. Who engaged you to conduct the Hartwell assessment? The county. Who specifically requested your services? Crawley looked at his hands. The request came through a property management office, he said. Whose property management office? Grice said. The room was absolutely still. It came through Holloway Land and Resource Management, Crawley said. The sound that moved through the room was not loud. It was almost quiet. But it was the sound of 20 people absorbing the same information at the same moment, and it had weight. Pratt looked up. Holloway looked at Voss. Voss wrote something. His pen moved too fast for a man who was confident. Grice said, and the Brennan assessment of 1882, the McCready assessment of 1883, the Farr assessment also 1883. Crawley looked up at him. I'd like to. Did you conduct all 4 assessments? Grice said. A pause. Yes, Crawley said. Were all 4 requested through Holloway Land and Resource Management? Another pause. Longer. Yes, Crawley said. And were all 4 properties subsequently acquired directly or through holding companies by interests connected to Garrett Holloway? Crawley looked at the table. I don't know what happened to the properties after. The documentation does, Grice said. He entered 4 property transfer records. Commissioner Pratt, I'd like to submit these for the record. Pratt looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at Holloway. Holloway met the commissioner's gaze steadily. He had the look of a man who had calculated that there was still a way out of this, that money and connection and the weight of established reputation could still tip the room his direction. He had sat in rooms like this before. He had tipped rooms like this before. He did not know what was about to happen. Grice said, Commissioner, I'd like to call one final witness. Pratt nodded. Grice said, Mrs. Clara Brennan. Clara Brennan stood up from the second row. She walked to the front of the room with the particular dignity of a woman who has been quiet for a long time about something that deserved to be said and has finally decided that the cost of speaking is less than the cost of another day's silence. She was small, and the room was not, but she stood in it like she owned every inch. Voss was on his feet immediately. Commissioner, this witness was not disclosed. Mrs. Brennan is a material witness with direct knowledge of a prior transaction central to the pattern of fraud being documented, Grice said without raising his voice. Her testimony is directly relevant to the scope of this proceeding. Pratt looked at both of them. He looked at the 4 property records in front of him. He looked at Crawley, who was looking at the floor. "I'll allow it," Pratt said. Voss sat down. He sat down slowly, and the slowness of it said something. Clara Brennan looked at Commissioner Pratt when Grice asked her his first question. She did not look at Holloway. "Mrs. Brennan," Grice said, "in 1882, you sold your homestead property on the southeast quarter of Red Willow Creek." "I did," she said. "Can you describe the circumstances that led to that sale?" Clara Brennan looked at the room. Her voice was steady. "I was told I owed back taxes I didn't know I had. The amount was more than I could pay. I had no one to advise me, no one to look at the papers, no one who told me I could fight it. A man came to me with an offer. He told me it was the best I was going to get." She paused. "I believed him. I sold." Another pause. "I know now that what he told me was not true. That the taxes were not real. That the assessment was not real. And that the property I sold for almost nothing sits on some of the best water access in this part of the territory." The room was very quiet. "If someone had told me I could fight it," Clara said, "I would have fought it. I just didn't know I could." She sat down. Mabel was looking at her hands on the table. Thomas's documents were spread in front of her, neat and organized, every date in order. She thought about Clara Brennan alone in a cabin in 1882, with no one to say, "You can fight this." With no Clem leaving a coffee cup on a windowsill. No Pete showing up to say he'd been wrong. No one in the yard when she came back from somewhere hard saying coffee's still hot, kitchen's empty if you want quiet. She thought about how close she had come to being the 1884 version of that story. Grice stood for his closing. He kept it short because the room had already heard everything that needed to be said. "Commissioner Pratt," he said, "the abandonment claim against the Hartwell property has no legal foundation. Mrs. Hartwell maintained contact with, worked on, and retained legal possession of her property throughout her temporary absence. The tax liability that underlies the claim is based on a fraudulent assessment conducted by an assessor with a direct financial relationship to the prospective buyer. And this is not an isolated situation. It is a pattern, documented across 4 properties, targeting isolated landowners on water access routes in this territory." He gathered his papers. "We ask that the abandonment claim be dismissed, the fraudulent assessment be invalidated, and the matter of the prior 3 property transactions be referred to the Territorial Attorney General for investigation." He sat down. Pratt was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the documents in front of him. He looked at Crawley. He looked at Holloway, who was very still now, very controlled, the smile entirely gone. "Mr. Voss," Pratt said. "Anything further?" Voss said, "We would request time to respond to the additional." "You've had time," Pratt said. "Not unkindly, but definitely finally. You've had the same time as everyone else in this room." Voss closed his folder. Pratt looked at the documents one more time. Then he looked up. "The abandonment claim is dismissed," he said. "The 1884 assessment of the Hartwell property is invalidated pending full review. The tax liability based on that assessment is suspended pending review." He looked at the county recorder at the side table. "I'll be writing to the Territorial Attorney General's office this afternoon regarding the 4 properties named in today's proceeding." He looked at the room. "We're done here." The sound that filled the room was not a cheer. It was something quieter than that, a collective exhale, the sound of people who have been holding their breath, letting it go at the same moment. Mabel sat very still. She put her hands flat on Thomas's documents. She felt the paper under her palms, years of his careful work. Everything he'd written down, because he'd believed that the truth properly recorded was a form of protection. He'd been right. Caleb put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. Just briefly. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She turned her hand over under his and pressed back once, and then she stood up. Clara Brennan was at her side before she'd taken 2 steps. "Thank you," Clara said. Her voice was not quite steady. "You didn't have to bring us into it. You could have just fought for your own peace." "I know," Mabel said. "But that's not how it works, is it? The only way to stop something like this is to show the whole shape of it. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Thomas was lucky, she said, to have someone who fights like you. He taught me how, Mabel said. Holloway left without speaking to anyone. She saw him go, saw the set of his shoulders, the controlled pace of a man who had calculated his losses and was already thinking about what came next. He was not finished. She knew that. Men like Holloway were never simply finished. They regrouped, recalculated, found new angles. But he was finished with her. She had made herself too expensive, too documented, too visible to be a viable target anymore. He would find someone else somewhere else, and she was going to make sure Grice's letter to the Attorney General made that as difficult as possible. She found Grice at the door. "The Attorney General referral," she said. "How long will that take?" "Months," he said honestly. "Maybe longer. These things move slowly." "But it moves," she said. "It moves," he agreed. "Clara Brennan," she said, "and the McCready family. Is there any recourse for what they lost?" Grice looked at her. "That's a harder fight," he said carefully. "The sales were completed, proving fraud after the fact, seeking remedy. Is it possible?" A pause. "Possible," he said. "Not easy." "Tell me what they'd need," she said. He told her. She wrote it down. Outside, the afternoon had moved on without caring about any of it, the way afternoons did, indifferent to outcomes. And the main street of Red Willow Creek was going about its business in the ordinary way of a town that had not just had its assumptions rearranged. Caleb was waiting at the wagon. Pete was nearby, and Clem and Walt and Douglas, all of them maintaining a respectful distance, with the particular tact of men who understood the moment required something quieter than celebration. Mabel walked to where Caleb was standing. She looked at him. "The property's mine," she said. "Yes," he said. "The assessment's gone." "Yes." "And Grice thinks the Attorney General will move on the others." "That's good news," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the street, at the town that had whispered about her, and decided things about her before she'd walked into a single room and made them look at paper instead of at her size and her circumstances and their own assumptions. She looked at Briggs's General Store and Mrs. Alderman's church on the corner, and the land office where Farnsworth was probably even now writing something in a ledger that was going to have to be corrected. Then she looked at Caleb. "You asked me a question," she said. "Before the hearing." He went still, just slightly. "You asked whether it bothered me," she said. "What people were saying about us. Not about my reputation in the abstract, about the specific thing they were implying." She held his gaze. "I told you I'd answer it after." "You did," he said. "It bothered me," she said, "because it wasn't true, and I don't like things said about me that aren't true." She paused. "But it also bothered me, and this is the part I've been thinking about since you asked, because of what it would mean if it were true. Because of what it would mean if the thing they were implying was actually something I wanted." The street moved around them. Someone's wagon went by. A dog barked somewhere. Caleb said nothing. He was looking at her with that full, direct attention of his, and she thought that this was the thing about him she had trusted first before anything else, that when he looked at you, he was actually looking. Not at a situation. Not at a problem to be managed. At you. "I'm not ready to say more than that right now," she said. "I've got a property to repair, and a dairy operation to run, and a referral letter to help write for the Attorney General, and about 40 other things that need doing before I can afford to think about anything that isn't practical." She held his gaze. "But I wanted you to know that the answer to your question isn't the simple answer. It's the complicated one." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "The complicated answer," he said slowly, "is the one I was hoping for." She looked at him. The edge of something that wasn't quite a smile. It was warmer than that, more unguarded than anything she'd let herself show in 3 years, moved across her face before she could stop it. She didn't stop it. "Let's go home," she said. The word came out before she'd decided on it. She heard it land and waited for the feeling of having said too much. It didn't come. Caleb heard it. She could tell by the way he moved, the easy, unhurried way he turned toward the wagon, the way his shoulders settled, something releasing in them that she hadn't realized had been held. Let's go home, he agreed. The ranch hands had ridden ahead. Mabel and Caleb drove back through the late afternoon with Thomas's documents on the seat between them, and the territory spread out around them in the way of a place that was very old and entirely indifferent to human drama and beautiful in spite of itself. She didn't talk much. He didn't either. The silence between them was the particular silence of two people who have been through something real together and don't need to narrate it. When they got back, she went to the dairy barn first. Old habit. She checked on Bess, checked the evening numbers, stood in the clean stall, with her hand against her cow's warm side. "We won, old girl," she said quietly. Bess was magnificently unimpressed. She turned her head and pressed it against Mabel's shoulder in the way she did when she wanted scratching, and Mabel scratched her ears and laughed a real laugh. Low and surprised, the kind that came from somewhere you hadn't been in a while. She hadn't laughed like that in 3 years. She stood there for another minute, just breathing, just being a woman in a barn with her cow on a winning day. Then she straightened up and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, because she had apparently been crying at some point without particularly noticing, and she walked out of the barn and back toward the house. Supper was already on the table when she came in. She didn't know who had made it. Mrs. Anders, the housekeeper, or possibly Pete, who had been making quiet overtures toward the kitchen since the week before. The hands were already seated. Clem was in his usual place. There was bread which she had baked 2 days ago, and which was still somehow present, and there was the low, comfortable sound of men at the end of a long day who had somewhere to be. She sat down. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then Clem, without looking up from his plate, said, "Good day." It was from Clem, an oration. "Yes," Mabel said. It was. And supper went on, and the evening went on, and the ranch went on, the way it always did, steady and unhurried and solid under her feet. And Mabel Hartwell ate her supper at a table that was starting to feel, without her permission, and without her quite knowing when it had happened, like hers. Later, washing dishes at the basin, she heard Caleb come in behind her. She heard him stop. "The homestead repairs," he said. "Walt and Douglas said they can spare time next week. Hank too, probably." "I can't ask them to." "Nobody's asking," he said. "They're offering." She turned from the basin. "Why?" she said. "Why do they keep doing that? They don't owe me anything." Caleb looked at her with a patience that was not condescending. It was the patience of someone who saw something clearly and was waiting for you to see it too. "Mabel," he said, "you fixed their dairy operation. You showed Pete how to be better than he was. You went into that hearing today, and you stood up for 3 other people who weren't there to stand up for themselves." He met her eyes. "Why do you think they'd offer?" She turned back to the basin. She did not have a good answer for that. She had spent so many years being the person people looked at with pity or doubt, or the particular carefully managed sympathy of those who considered her a problem to be solved, that she genuinely did not know in her body what to do with being the person people showed up for. She was going to have to learn. "Tell them Tuesday," she said. "I'll have the lumber sorted by then." "Tuesday," he said. She heard him move toward the door, then stop. "Mabel," he said. She said. She had caught the habit from Clem. "For what it's worth," he said, "what you did in that room today, standing up there with those papers, knowing what was at stake, not flinching." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas would have been proud. She gripped the basin. She stood there for a moment with her hands in the water and her jaw tight and her eyes stinging in a way she was not going to acknowledge, and she breathed and she waited until she was certain of her voice. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that." He left. She finished the dishes. She dried her hands on the cloth hanging by the basin, and she folded it neatly, the way she always did, and she stood in the kitchen of a house that was not hers and was beginning to feel like home, and she let herself have 1 full minute of feeling all of it. The hearing, the documents, Caleb's hand over hers on the table, Clara Brennan's voice, Clem's 2 words at supper, Thomas's receipts organized in her handwriting in a stack that had just dismantled a 3-year fraud, and then she blew out the kitchen lamp and went to bed. Outside, the territory settled into its enormous quiet, and for the first time since the roof came down, Mabel Hartwell did not lie awake, going over everything that needed to be done. She closed her eyes, and her hands were still, and she slept. The roof went up on a Tuesday. Walt had said he could spare time, and he'd meant it. He showed up before sunrise with Douglas and Hank and two men from a neighboring spread, who Mabel had never met, but who apparently knew Walt well enough to show up when he asked. Pete arrived last slightly out of breath with a bag of nails he'd bought himself in town the day before, and sat on the ground in front of Mabel without a word. She looked at the nails, then at Pete. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and picked up a hammer and went to work. By noon, the main structure was sound. By late afternoon, the new roof section was up and sealed, and Mabel stood inside her homestead for the first time in 2 months and looked up at solid timber above her head and felt something move through her that she didn't have a precise name for. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. The feeling of a thing restored that was supposed to have been permanent and had briefly terribly not been. She pressed her hand flat against the wall Thomas had built. It held. She had not cried at the hearing. She had not cried when Pratt dismissed the claim. She had not cried when Caleb put his hand over hers, or when Clara Brennan said, "Thomas was lucky to have someone who fights like you," or when Clem said, "Good day" at supper with the weight of a man delivering a sermon. She cried now alone in the back room, with the smell of new timber and old cedar around her quietly and briefly and completely, and then she wiped her face and went outside to feed the men who'd given her their Tuesday. Caleb was leaning on the fence when she came out. He'd been there most of the day, not working the roof himself, not inserting himself into something the hands had organized on their own, but present, available, the way he always was. She'd noticed that about him in the weeks she'd been here. He didn't need to be at the center of things to be the reason things were steady. "How does it look?" he said. "It looks like a roof," she said. "A real one." "Good," he said. "That's what it's supposed to look like." She looked at him. "You called in a favor for those two men from the Taggart spread." It was not a question. She'd figured it out around mid-morning when she'd watched the way Walt deferred to them on the timber placement, the particular body language of men, returning a debt, rather than offering a kindness. Caleb said nothing. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You didn't ask," he said. Caleb. "Mabel," he said quietly. "Let people help you. You're very good at helping other people. You're still learning the other direction." He looked at the house. "It's a good roof. That's what matters." She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument forming something about independence, about not wanting to owe about the careful accounting she'd been keeping since the first morning in his kitchen. She knew the argument by heart. She'd been making it to herself for 2 months. She let it go. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. Simple. No performance around it. They stood at the fence for a moment side by side, looking at the homestead that had a real roof again, and the afternoon was cooling toward evening, and the men on the other side of the yard were gathering tools and talking the easy talk of people who'd done something solid with their day. "I need to ask you something," Mabel said. "All right," he said. "The dairy operation," she said. "The numbers this month." "Up 43% from April," he said. "Grice told me the projections for next quarter look better still." "I know," she said. "I wrote the projections." She looked at him sideways. "I want a formal contract, wages, responsibilities, terms, written down." He turned to look at her. "We agreed on terms last month. We agreed on a number," she said. "I want a contract, with my name on it as dairy manager, legal and signed." She held his gaze. "I've learned something about the value of paper." He studied her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. "I'll have Grice draft it," he said. "I'll draft it myself," she said. "Grice can review it." He laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind she'd heard from him maybe 3 times in 2 months, and each time it had surprised her, because it was so different from his usual register, warm in a way that his careful steadiness sometimes obscured. She liked the laugh. She'd liked it each time she'd heard it. She did not say that. "All right," he said when the laugh had settled. "You draft it." The formal contract was signed 4 days later. Mabel Hartwell, dairy manager, Whitmore Ranch, Red Willow Creek, Montana Territory, effective. The 1st of September, 1884. Wages, responsibilities, terms. all of it written in her own precise hand, and reviewed by Grice, and signed by both of them at the kitchen table with Pete and Clem as witnesses, which had not been her original plan, but which Clem had apparently decided was necessary, and nobody argued with Clem. Afterward, Pete said, "Does this mean you're staying?" "It means I have a job," she said. "Same as you." "That's not," he started. "Pete," Clem said without looking up from his coffee. Pete stopped, but he was smiling when he left the kitchen, which told her he'd understood the answer she hadn't quite given. The letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office arrived 3 weeks later. Grice forwarded it with a note. "They're moving faster than expected. Holloway has retained counsel in Helena. This is going to be a real fight, but we have the documents and we have the witnesses. I'll keep you informed." Mabel read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in the chest she'd brought from the homestead, the one Thomas had built into the wall with the tar on the seams. She kept it at the Whitmore Ranch now. She had not thought too carefully about what it meant that she'd moved it here. She thought about it now. She was sitting on the edge of her bed in the east-facing room when Caleb knocked on the open door. She looked up. "Grice's letter," he said. "They're moving on Holloway," she said. "Formally." "I know," he said. "He sent me a copy too." He leaned against the doorframe. "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved," she said honestly. "And tired. And," she stopped. "And," he said, "I keep thinking about Clara Brennan," she said. "About those 2 years she spent thinking she'd just been unlucky. That she'd just made a bad decision. That it was her fault." She looked at the chest. "I keep thinking about how different her story would have been if someone had told her she could fight it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You can't go back," he said. "You can only go forward." "I know," she said. "But going forward means making sure it doesn't happen to the next one." She looked up at him. "I've been talking to Grice about that. About whether there's a way to make the water rights documentation for every small property in this area publicly filed. Harder to falsify. Harder to use as leverage." Caleb looked at her. "That would take a lot of work," she said. "I know. Years probably. I'd need someone with land standing in the territory willing to put their name on it." She held his gaze. "Someone the county commission would have to take seriously." He was quiet. "I'm not asking yet," she said. "I'm telling you what I'm thinking." "All right," he said. "I'm listening." "Good," she said. "Because I'm going to keep thinking about it, and eventually I'm going to ask." She looked back at the chest. "Thomas would have thought it was worth doing." "Thomas sounds like he was a remarkable man," Caleb said. "He was," she said. "He was steady and careful, and he believed in paper, and he loved me without ever making me feel like a burden." She paused. "He'd have liked you. I've thought about that a lot." The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. "Is that right?" he said. Not a question, but not nothing either. "He was a good judge of character," she said. "Better than most." Another pause. Longer. "Mabel," he said. "I want to say something. And I want to say it plainly because I don't know another way to say things." "All right," she said. "I have been living on this ranch alone for 14 years, he said. "I've had hands come and go, and I've had neighbors and business dealings, and a life that has been by most measures a decent one. I didn't think much was missing from it." He looked at her steadily. "And then you walked in with that cow and that rope and that look on your face, and inside of 2 weeks you'd fixed 3 things I'd been dealing with for years and made this house feel different than it's ever felt." He paused. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean. So I want you to know that what I'm about to say I mean exactly." She held very still. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as the dairy manager, not as the woman in the room off the kitchen. I'd like you to stay because this place is better with you in it, and because I am better with you in it, and because whatever you want to build, the dairy operation, the water rights documentation, whatever comes next, I would very much like to be part of it." He held her gaze. "If that's something you'd want." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the 3-mile walk, the rope in her hand, the way she'd shoved it against his chest because she couldn't afford to look weak. She thought about the first supper at 6 o'clock sharp, and the coffee always on the stove, and the night she'd come back from the homestead with grief in her face, and he'd said nothing except that the kitchen was quiet if she wanted it. She thought about Thomas, who had walked up to her at a church social and said, "I believe this dance is yours if you'd like it," and she had said yes without hesitation, because she'd been 23 and brave. She was 32 now. She was not 23. She had buried a husband and fought a land fraud and managed a dairy operation and stood in front of a county commissioner with 6 years of paper and made him see something he'd been paid not to see. She was considerably braver than she'd been at 23. "I'd want that," she said. He let out a breath, just small, but she heard it. "Good," he said. "But I keep my contract," she said. He blinked. "I'm not giving up the contract," she said. "I earned it. It stays." And there was that laugh again, sudden and real and warm, filling the room with something that felt like light. "The contract stays," he said. "And my name is on the dairy records," she said. "Formally. Not as Mrs. Whitmore eventually, whenever that becomes relevant." "Whenever that becomes relevant," he repeated with the careful control of a man who was very pleased and was attempting to be dignified about it. "But as Mabel Hartwell dairy manager," she said. "That's who I am. That's who I've been. I'm not trading that in." "I wouldn't ask you to," he said. "I never would." She believed him. That was the thing, she genuinely believed him, not because she was naive or desperate or had run out of options, but because she had watched this man for 2 months. Had watched how he handled Holloway and Pete and Clem's silences and her grief and her stubbornness and her very specific requirements about dairy rotation schedules, and she knew exactly what kind of man he was. Thomas had taught her how to read people. She'd been reading Caleb Whitmore since the first morning. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He didn't move from the doorframe. She didn't move from the bed. They looked at each other across the small room, and the east-facing window was going gold with late afternoon, and somewhere across the yard, Bess was doing whatever Bess did in the evenings, and the roof above them was solid in every direction. "Supper's in an hour," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I made the bread." "I know," he said. "I could smell it from the barn." She stood up. "Then you'd better wash up. I don't hold plates." He laughed again as he went, and she listened to it. Go down the hallway, and she stood in her room for a moment, with her hand on the cedar chest, and her heart doing something complicated and wonderful that she had not expected to feel again. She let herself feel it, all of it, without folding it small or setting it aside or reminding herself to be practical. She just stood there and felt it the way you were supposed to feel things when they were real all the way through with both hands. Then she went to check on her bread. The months that followed were not simple. Holloway's case with the Attorney General moved slowly, the way Grice had warned it would, and there were days when Mabel sat down with the latest correspondence and felt the grinding frustration of a system that protected the powerful by requiring the determined to be infinitely patient. There were hearings she attended and documents she filed and depositions she gave twice, once in Red Willow Creek and once in Helena, where she sat across a long table from Holloway's Helena lawyer and answered questions for 4 hours without flinching once. Clara Brennan came to both hearings. She was not the only one anymore. By November 2, more women had come forward, one connected to the McCready property, one whose land loss predated even Clara's, a woman named Rose Abbott, who had sold in 1881 and spent 3 years believing herself foolish for it. Grice added both of them to the proceeding. The shape of Holloway's system was becoming undeniable, and even the commissioner who had presided at Mabel's hearing, Gerald Pratt, who had spent a career appearing neutral, had submitted a written statement supporting the Attorney General's investigation. People noticed. The town that had whispered about Mabel Hartwell's arrangement with the rancher was now watching something else. Was watching a woman stand up in rooms full of lawyers and commissioners and men who had been deciding things without her for years and make them see what they'd been looking at wrong. Mrs. Alderman stopped her on the street in October. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for what I said, about you being harder." "You said clearer," Mabel said, "and you weren't wrong about that either." "I meant it as a criticism," Mrs. Alderman said. I was wrong to. She paused. What you're doing, what you did for those other women, I didn't understand it at first. I thought you were just protecting your own property. I was, Mabel said. And theirs. Both things can be true. Mrs. Alderman looked at her for a long moment. Thomas would have been proud, she said. It was the second time someone had said that to her. She thought it would get easier to hear. It didn't quite. But it got different, less sharp, more warm, like a scar that had finished hurting and become simply a part of the skin. Thank you, she said, for coming to tell me. The Attorney General's ruling came down in February of 1885. Garrett Holloway was found to have engaged in systematic fraud across 4 properties using a paid assessor to manufacture false tax liabilities, targeting isolated landowners on water access routes. The ruling invalidated all 4 assessments. It mandated restitution proceedings for the 3 completed sales. It revoked Holloway's land and resource management company's operating status in the territory and referred the matter for criminal prosecution. Grice sent the ruling by express mail with a note that said simply, "You were right about the pattern. Well done." Mabel read the ruling at the kitchen table. Then she set it down and looked at it for a long moment. Caleb came in, saw her face, saw the paper. "Good news," he said, not a question. "The best," she said. He sat down across from her. All of it, she said. Restitution for Clara, for Rose Abbott, for the McCready family. She looked up. "They're going to get something back." "Because of you," he said. "Because of Thomas's receipts," she said. "And Grice. And Clara being willing to stand up. And you." She held his gaze. "I had help. I keep saying that, and people keep not quite believing me." "People like to have a single hero," Caleb said. "It's tidier." "Life isn't tidy," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She slid the ruling across the table so he could read it. He read it carefully, the way he read everything, all the way through, no skimming. She watched him read and thought about the first morning she'd handed him her notebook in the barn, and he'd asked 3 good questions, and she'd thought, this man knows how to listen. She'd been right about that. She'd been right about a lot of things. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at her. "What's next?" he said. Because he knew her. He knew she didn't stop at done, she stopped at finished, and those were not the same thing. "The water rights documentation," she said. "I've been talking to Grice about it for months. There's a way to file a comprehensive public record for all the small properties in the county. Something that makes it much harder to fraudulently reassess or manufacture abandonment claims. It would require..." She paused. "It would require someone with significant land standing in the territory to co-file. Someone the county commission would have to take seriously." Caleb looked at her. "You said eventually you'd ask," he said. "I'm asking now," she said. "Then yes," he said, simply, without deliberation. "Whatever you need." She looked at him across the table. This man who had handed back a rope and said, "Keep your cow, stay anyway," who had never once made her feel like charity or obligation or a problem to be solved, who had stood beside her at a county hearing and not in front of her, who had laughed in her kitchen and learned the dairy numbers and asked one very specific question about what bothered her and waited 5 months for a proper answer. "Caleb," she said. He said. "I'm ready to answer that question now," she said. "The complicated one." He went still. "All right," he said. "It bothered me," she said, "because it wasn't true yet. And I wanted it to be true. I'd wanted it to be true for longer than I'd admitted to myself, and having people say it out loud, even wrongly, even cruelly, made me have to look at what I actually felt instead of what was practical." She held his gaze. "That's the complicated answer." He looked at her for a long moment. "Not yet," he said quietly. "You said it wasn't true yet." "I did," she said. "What would make true?" he said. "Ask me properly," she said. He stood up. He walked around the table, unhurried, deliberate the way he did everything, and he stopped in front of her, and she stood up too, because she was not going to sit down for this. She had never needed to sit down for anything, and she looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at Farnsworth and Voss and Holloway himself, except that this was nothing like any of those things. This was the opposite of all of those things. "Mabel Hartwell," he said, "will you stay, not for the contract, not for the dairy operation, not because the homestead needs work, or the Attorney General needs witnesses, or any other practical reason?" He held her gaze. "Will you stay because you want to? Because this is where you want to be?" "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no rehearsal. Just the word, clean and whole, the same way she'd answered Thomas at the church social 20 years ago. Because when the right question came, you didn't need to think about the answer. You'd already known it. You'd just been waiting for someone to ask. He put his hand against her face, just his palm, warm and steady, the way he was always warm and steady, and she put her hand over his, the way she had on the hearing table, and they stood like that in the kitchen for a moment, that had no particular drama to it, and was because of that exactly right. "I should check the dairy numbers," she said finally. "You should," he agreed, not moving. "And there's bread rising." "There is?" he said. She smiled. A full one, the kind she hadn't had to manage or hold back or be careful about. He smiled back. And that was that. The wedding was in May, small and plain, and exactly what both of them wanted: Clem and Pete as witnesses. Clara Brennan in the front row. Grice, who had driven up from Billings because he said he wanted to see how the story ended, and Mrs. Alderman, who wept with the particular enthusiasm of a woman who had been wrong about someone and was overcompensating. Mabel wore her best dress, which she had made herself over the winter, and she carried a single wildflower that Pete had picked that morning and presented to her with approximately 9 times more solemnity than the occasion strictly required, and she had taken it without laughing at him, which she considered one of the kinder things she'd done all year. At the reception afterward dinner at the ranch, the long table full, loud and warm, Clem raised his coffee cup and said, "Good." Everyone laughed, including Mabel, including Caleb, and the laughter filled the house and went out into the yard and dissolved into the Montana evening, and Bess distantly lowed once in response, which Pete swore to his dying day was the cow's way of agreeing. The dairy operation became by 1887 the most productive in the county. The Water Rights Documentation Project, co-filed by Mabel Hartwell, Whitmore and Caleb Whitmore with Grice's legal support, was adopted as a county standard in 1886 and referenced in 2 subsequent territorial land reform debates as a model for protecting small property holders. Clara Brennan's restitution came through in the summer of 1885. Rose Abbott's came in the fall. The McCready family rebuilt. Garrett Holloway was convicted of fraud in June of 1885 and lost every landholding he'd accumulated through Crawley's assessments. He left the territory. Nobody who mattered was sorry. And in Red Willow Creek in the county that had once whispered about a plus-size widow and the arrangement she'd made with the cold rancher on the hill, people told a different story. They told it to their daughters. They told it in the way of good stories, not always precisely, not always with every detail right, but with the shape of it intact, the part that mattered preserved. They said there was a woman who came with nothing but a cow, and the truth, and she didn't flinch, and she didn't fold, and she didn't let anyone make her smaller than she was. She stood up in rooms full of people who'd already decided she didn't matter, and she made them look at the paper. And the paper said what it said. And the truth did what it does. It outlasted the money. It outlasted the pressure. It outlasted every story someone else tried to tell about her. They said she built something worth building, and she let herself be loved by someone worth loving, and she didn't apologize for either. And across the years, in the ranch that held, and the homestead that stood repaired under its solid roof, and the dairy that hummed with the work of people who knew what they were doing, the woman who had walked 3 miles with a cow on a rope and a prepared speech and a heart full of desperate, stubborn, undefeated hope, that woman lived her life the only way she had ever known how to live it. Fully, honestly, without lowering her eyes for anyone. Some gifts cannot be taken from you no matter what. Garrett Holloway or time or grief or a Montana winter tries to do. Some things once earned stay earned. Some people once seen clearly cannot be unseen. Mabel Hartwell had walked into the stranger's yard, expecting to lose everything. Instead, she had shown the whole territory what one woman with enough paper and enough courage, and one person standing beside her who knew the difference between rescue and respect, could build from nothing. And that was not a small thing. That was everything.